of renewing parish life, each with a particular focus. Tonight it has to do with improving our liturgical celebration, preparing ourselves for the Lenten season. I'd like to do something I guess I ordinarily don't do, but begin with a meditation. We're using this in our own church tomorrow for our services for Ash Wednesday. So I'd just like to invite you to imaginatively to get in this. So I'd like to imagine us walking the path of Lent in the company of Jesus Christ. Christ at our side, and our eyes meet. His penetrating glance demands attention. His eyes speak to our heart. Rend your hearts, not your garments. Strive for a genuine interior conversion, which makes your worship authentic. Pray and meditate not for show, but to open your heart to the Spirit within. Fast and discipline yourself not as punishment, but so you can be more attentive to the call of the gracious one. Give alms and work for justice, not for applause, but to further the cause of God. Lord, we know we cannot escape your loving glance. May it indeed touch our hearts so we can make the Lenten journey empowered by your Spirit. Well, that's an effort to move ourselves imaginatively into the Lenten season. The way I want to go about this tonight is to prepare ourselves through my presentation for hearing one of the Gospels that we're going to hear on the fourth Sunday of Lent. That's the familiar parable of the prodigal son. So what I want to do is sort of the whole presentation is trying to exemplify the point of how we can prepare ourselves to enter more fully into the experience that we have when we gather for liturgy during the Lenten season. So the first sort of very remote kind of preparation, if we're going to, when we get there and we're going to hear this gospel, and it's going to mean something to it, it's got to have to do with our whole life preparation. In other words, one of the things we see about liturgy as a whole is its intrinsic connection with life, with our total human experience. So one of the ways we would try to prepare ourselves to hear that gospel better is to have a regimen going during the Lenten season. So we have particular ways that we might go about that regimen. Might attend to our diet, for example. We might think of fasting, bringing that back into part of our preparation. It has to do with proper exercise, getting ourselves prepared in that way, on the theory that our physical being is essential to what we are, and we bring that to the liturgical celebration. It would include some spiritual reading and some regular meditation. It would be an effort to perhaps attune ourselves to the biblical world, because when we get there, we're going to be hearing stories out of the Bible. So that might require some scripture reading throughout the Lenten season to prepare ourselves in that way. So if we're going to be effective, we're going to have to somehow quiet our mind and heart. That means adopting some sort of a meditation technique ahead of time, some mode of reflection, some particular type of prayer. There are a lot of those available in the history of our Christian tradition. Way back in the time of St. Benedict in the 6th century, we have his notion that he called Lectio Divina, which meant the reading of the scriptures in a slow, meditative way, where one would just read a verse and think about it, and no thoughts come, you read on. But as soon as you get one that grabs you, you stay with it and think about it, meditate on it, let it roll around in your mind and heart. So we might try that kind of method. Could also use the imaginative method given to us by Ignatius of Loyola in the spiritual exercises. something that I tried to do in that first meditation we did there. It says, let's put ourselves in the company of Jesus. Let us use our imagination. So in this case, it's like, let's imagine Jesus is walking at our side. Let's imagine that he glances at us and our eyes meet. Let's imagine that that penetrates through the superficiality and somehow gets right into my soul, into my heart. And then what does that glance say to me? What does that penetrating contact with the Lord mean to me? So that would be an example of imaginative kind of meditation. And then we might use something called centering prayer, where we would repeat over and over a particular mantra or short prayer while we're conscious of our breathing. So these would be various prayer techniques, approaches to meditation that could help attune us. So when we get there and we hear this gospel of the prodigal son, we're ready. The heart is quieted to some degree. We've got ourselves under some sort of, in some state of repose so that the message can get in. Also, it would be important whenever what kind of prayer we do in preparation for this, that there's a listening component. That we're not just saying a lot of Our Fathers or Hail Marys, or we're not just talking a lot to God, but we remember to listen, to be quiet, to see how our conscience speaks to us. How that inner sanctuary that the Second Vatican Council talked about, that we call conscience, is attuned to whatever God might be saying to us. So that would be what I would call maybe some sort of remote kind of preparation for all of that. That would be a way of trying to get at how we're going to hear this gospel in a better way. Then we also have to, in terms of preparation, be aware of the messages that we get in the culture as a whole, and especially the symbolic messages that come across. I'm very influenced in my lecture tonight, incidentally, by one particular book on your handout. It's by Bernard Cook. It's called The Distancing of God. It's a rather difficult book, I think, in some ways, but very rewarding, and it is a whole meditation on the topic of symbols and how symbols work. And as I go through my presentation this evening, I really am drawing a lot on Bernard Cook's ideas. But what we've got to figure out in terms of being self-critical as we prepare for coming to this liturgy is to see how there are sets of symbols that are working on us, the messages that we get from our culture, and especially what the master symbols are, the dominant symbols that collect so many ideas. If we want to know what a dominant symbol would be out of our biblical literature, it would be the Exodus. The Exodus experience for Israel was a paradigm of how God works with human beings. It was a model. If you want to know what God is like, you look at the Exodus. If you want to know how we're supposed to act and what mistakes we can make, you look at the Exodus. And that keeps getting repeated over and over throughout the biblical period, rethinking what does the Exodus mean. So that's an example of a master symbol. Well, we might look at our culture then and we ask ourselves, well, what are the master symbols or the dominant ones that really touch us? Well, one clearly is the flag. In our culture, if someone deals badly with the flag, we say they desecrated it. It tells us that the flag is a sacred symbol. And so to mess with the flag is to mess with something sacred, to desecrate it one way or another. The flag represents the American dream, our ideals, what we are really all about, how we're supposed to function. The flag would be a major one. Another extremely important master symbol for us would be the free market. So we live in a capitalistic system, and we celebrate this free market as the way that things get done. We have Adam Smith's once used phrase in his Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand. In other words, somehow this market works because God guides it. God's invisible hand is at work, and therefore people can act out of their own self-interest, but it will somehow work out to better the whole of our country and the whole of our economy. We have another sort of dominant symbol of what the fully human person is. And by and large, I would say that fully human person is what we would call the managerial type. It is the person who's really with it, that we pay large dollars to and we respect, is the person who can get things done, who's effective, efficient, can use and marshal particular means to achieve an end. So whether that is to market a product or to help sell it through advertising, whatever, but it's get it done. The managerial type becomes a symbol of how we think people ought to be. And we try to train young people to be more like that. And people come to college so that they can learn the skills to be like that, so that they can be successful within the society and make a good salary and hopefully make some contribution out of that. So we have the managerial image that would be another sort of what I call a dominant symbol in our culture. Well, when we come into the liturgy, one of my points would be is it's good to know what symbols are at work in our own mind and heart. What are the dominant ones? And what are the ones of lesser importance? And how do they work on it? The theory of it is this, that from the culture, we drink in the symbols. We learn them from growing up in the family and in the culture, and therefore we make it our own. It becomes like a grid through which we look at life. The symbols form a pattern inside us, and we tend to see the world in that way. Of course, the great symbol for all of us is language. To grow up in the United States in which our mother tongue is English means that we see certain things about the world, but we miss other things. The language forms a grid. And in other words, the idea that we somehow just experience life, and whether you live in India or the United States, the experience is just totally common, is not true. What happens is that language dictates what we notice and what we don't notice. You know, and a common example I always use in this regard is, how do we refer to an unmarried woman when she gets past a certain age? We have a word for that. The word is spinster. And the word carries all kind of connotations. It has all kind of negative connotations in the culture. You can play that off. We got another word for men who are past a certain age and aren't married. We call them bachelors. And the word has a totally different feeling to us than the word spinster does. Or we have other negative phrases we use for women not married and so on. Now, what that means is, as soon as the language programs what you detect and what you see, so that it already shapes the perception that somehow this woman not married cannot be living a full life or cannot be functioning effectively. And therefore it becomes hard to see the ways that single women in our culture make a contribution, because the language focuses on it. So we must understand, if we're going to do this liturgy thing effectively, what baggage we're bringing to the celebration when we come there, and how the cultural symbols, dominant ones, language as a whole, influence our perception. Now we must, as we do that, it's good to get a sense of the power and potential for good that we find in the secular symbols that are around. After last week's class, Mary Jane DeZeni wrote me a wonderful piece on the Winter Olympics and the symbolism involved in that. And you might think of the opening and closing ceremonies as a good example, where we have the great symbolism of the flame and of diverse people coming together, and people from all over sharing their pins with one another, a sign. It's a symbol of saying, I share with you my culture, my background. I want to be friends with you, even though I come from a different country. And so the Olympics become one sort of gigantic ritual or symbol for sort of some of the best aspirations of the human family, where we could compete without rancor, where people would compete against their own potential, where people would find some celebration and joy in winning a bronze medal, even though they didn't happen to be number one, where some people would be pleased just to compete, where nations would come together, not on the basis of war or fighting, but on the basis of cooperation, mutuality, friendship. So it represents the way symbols, again, work in the world as a whole, one of the positive senses of how symbols might work. On the other hand, we could look at the world of advertising, and as we would see it on television, and what that would end up saying to us about the good life, what really counts. Very often that is based, of course, on selling us, the need to have more, and selling us on the basis of that we are valued according to the status we have achieved economically in the society. So what we're trying to do here is to get some sort of sense, I suppose, of what how symbols work on us before we even would come to the liturgy. Let me just stop and see if anybody wants to ask me anything. My plan tonight is sort of give my lecture straight through, and then have time for questions, I hope. So if anybody want to ask me anything at this point. Remember, after one thing, at the end of this, I'm going to read the prodigal son story, and hopefully we're going to hear it in a way deeper and better than maybe we have heard it in the past. Well, I'm ready to launch again if... Now, one of the next things that we would want to see, it seems to me, as we come to the liturgy, is what are we expecting there? That is, what is happening when we gather for this event? And immediately I use the word that I think is important, and that is, there's a way in which the liturgy is a unique event, sort of not repeatable in a way. I always feel that after a Mass that goes well, one might say, well, I'd like to do that again or try that again, and inside I know that'll never work that way again. All the dynamics are different. Whatever the people are thinking there, feeling, however the focus goes, how people are hearing the readings, how well they were done, what mood was established, and so on, how the singing went. It's all a unique kind of event. It's a happening. And it's a happening in which we are all to be involved. And so what we like to say in liturgical circles, sacramental theology these days, is that it is something, not an event like theater. You go there and you're a spectator. It's definitely not theater in that way, but it is a gathering in which we, those who gather for the liturgy, are the sacrament, the sign. The assembly itself is the dominant sign value. It's we together, gathered together, that speak about whatever the reality that we're encountering is about. It's not just that the consecrated bread given out is the symbol. No, it's not just that the Bible read from is the symbol, but it's the gathering that's the symbol. And what that sets up is a need to say, well, we're all important to this. We all have to play our role. That's why in the modern liturgy, as Reformed, we say, well, everybody's got their job. The priest shouldn't do it all. It's not the priest's show. It's a common action. It's a liturgy. It's a group activity, and we have our roles to play, and it'll work only to the degree that we put something into it. I have this theory that there's sort of a critical mass in any liturgy. That what comes is the attitude the people who come there bring to it. And there's sort of a thing that occurs on the part of some. Now, if that group is sort of into it and wants it to go well, and they're listening, or they want to sing, or they want to get into it, is like 10%, then you can't make it work. It won't happen in that sense where there's that live sense and the feeling of spirit and where afterwards says, boy, that's moving, or that's full or inspirational. 10% won't do it. In literature, I see it happen. I don't know what the number is, but I know there's some critical thing that happens periodically, and that's when I'm the celebrating way, where enough people are really supplying something that it becomes a spirit-filled event for everybody present, and not many people walk out just saying, well, that wow, or it didn't do anything for me. But the hard thing is to figure out how to get there, and how to get enough people that with that mindset that I've got to contribute. In other words, the big thing, so many people go to Mass and say, what can I get out of it? If we got 90% there, what can I get out of it, then it doesn't work. You have to have a certain number. I always think it's something over 50% that have to be feeling I came to give something, to participate, to help the other people, to make it work. Just keep your eyes open for liturgy sometimes when it works and see if there isn't some different feeling that one gets along that line. But anyway, that's part of this sense of what is it that's happening when we go there. We're not going there for a show. We're not going there just to get something, but we need to be going there to participate, to be part of it, to make our contribution, to make sure this liturgy works well. Here's another thing that I think it is when we get there, and that is, it is a dialogue. There's a dialogic character to it. That is, there is a way in which God speaks to us, and in which we try to respond to that call of God. And it goes on throughout the whole liturgy. So the priest says, "The Lord be with you," and there's supposed to be a response, "and also with you." You know, and then we hear the Word of God, and it's like God speaking to us, the Lord speaking to us, the parable of the Good Samaritan, saying it over to us once more. And we're hearing that, and then, but the only way it works is that there's a response, like, well, yeah, I got to go out and live like that, or I'm going to try harder, or I'm going to find my, let the Lord heal me in some way. Whatever it is, we need to have that dialogic character. And then, so what happens is he speaks to us in the liturgy of the Word, and then we try to answer through the prayer of thanksgiving that we call the liturgy of the Eucharist. So there's got to be a back and forth, and a lot of the reforms in the liturgy were trying to get us to do that, to see that. Got to have some sense like that. Next point about what's happening there is that it is symbolic. Whatever's going on there is in the realm of symbol. It's not in the realm of, literal explanation of things, or one-to-one, or rational discourse. It's not like a lecture where I'm saying point 1, 2, 3. Liturgy is symbol. St. Thomas Aquinas taught us that back in the 13th century when he said that the Christ is present in the bread and wine under the sign of bread and wine. That's what Christ isn't really present in the sense that he's like a little man inside the host, hiding in a lot of hosts. When we say that Christ is present, it's not that kind of physical presence. That confuses a lot of people who grew up in the Catholic tradition. Thomas Aquinas, the best of tradition, always said, no, Christ is present under a sign. The sign of bread and wine. It's a symbolic presence. So we always fought Protestants because they said, well, Christ is only symbolically present. But as a matter of fact, that's exactly how he is present, under the symbols of bread and wine. The Lord is symbolically present. But that is a very real presence. Symbols are very real things. So that takes us, if we say, right now we got to say the liturgy is symbolic. Now, how do you get a feeling for, when I say symbols are real, you can't get anything more real than symbols. How are we going to get a feel for that? Well, my teacher, Karl Rahner, said we all got one good way of understanding that we can't escape. That is, we ourselves are symbolic creatures. Our body is the symbol of who we are. We have a body and we are a body. Our bodiliness is symbolic. The body, if I want to get an idea across to you right now, I'm going like this. And what does that mean? That means there's something I'm feeling inside myself or something I know that I'm trying to get across. And we call that these days body language. So that the body speaks. The body is a language. The body is already part of what symbol is. I'm not just identified with my body, because we have another word. We say, I have a body, but we also say, I am my body. Both things seem to be true somehow. And it's hard to figure out what we exactly mean by that, but both things seem to be true. I have a body, but I also am my body. And that helps us to see what a real symbol is. Symbols are not like red lights out there saying you better stop when you get to the intersection. That's a sign. And that could be arbitrary. You change it tomorrow and say green means stop and red means that you go. But you can't change this. This is it. This is the reality. And it's linked to my being, to my spirit, to my soul, to me. And now I have to create with the will. The symbol body lets me interact. It lets us talk to one another. It lets us give the signal about what we're all about. It allows us to tell each other really going inside of it. That's something that's going on in liturgy. It's a symbolic act. Now these symbols, interesting, but symbols have a way of touching us in a way that that rational, of course, can't. And that's an odd thing. But you're saying symbol means more than you can put into words. The obvious thing is wedding rings mean to spouses. I mean, what does that wedding ring mean to you? Well, I'll tell you, it's worth $700, and, well, I mean, that isn't a thing that wasn't say. No, there's a deeper reality about it. The ring saying something about love, shit, about 1,000 years, about love making, about fights, about disagreement, saying 1,000 things that you couldn't put into words. That's symbols function. They just at a level deeper than just our reason. And they communicate knowledge to us, communicate ideas, tells us something about reality, tells us about the interaction that's going on. And these symbols also have a power to transmit a larger meaning. So when we gather at the Eucharist, there's one Eucharistic prayer sometimes used that says, this is the one unchanging sign which links us to ages, which links us to Christians of different ages, past and to come. It's the one unchanging sign which links us to other people. And so symbols are the way we transmit the culture. It's the way we transmit the heritage. So if you want your offspring to grow up and have the Catholic faith or have the Lutheran faith or whatever it is, then they have to participate in the ritual, the enacted symbols, the actions which are connected together by various symbols. They learn it in a way that they can never learn in catechism class. So if you had your choice, I can only either teach them catechism or I can take them to liturgy. You're much better off to take them to liturgy, because that's where we're touched in the heart. That's where it gets into our bones and blood. Liturgy as a way of passing on the heritage. What happens in symbols is that a whole bunch of meanings get, as the language the linguists like to use, it gets sedimented. It coalesces. And a whole bunch of stuff is contained in that one symbol of giving the ring, or wearing the ring, or of eating bread and wine together. A whole bunch of ideas get coalesced right there. You can never put them all into words, but then if you participate in it, you begin to get touched in your heart and so on. So part of what is happening when we go to liturgy is we're involved in a symbolic kind of action. We have to remember that. That's why I guess a lot of liturgists say, well, we shouldn't be explaining things too much. Shouldn't give explanations of what's happening in the liturgy. You should let it happen. Let the symbols speak to people. Don't get in the way of it. It also suggests that people who come to the liturgy to celebrate will always bring a different set of experiences. Some people come there are sad. Some who come there are happy. Some come needy. Some come with a sense of gratitude. And the great contention in the Christian faith is that liturgy can help you no matter what you bring to it. It can help both the sad and the joyful to see more clearly what it's all about. So what the symbol does to participate in the liturgy is it helps to light up what is going on with us always and everywhere. It tells us the most important things about life. It puts us in touch with the deeper dimension of what human existence is all about. So it's telling us things like, even in the midst of carrying heavy crosses and dealing with your illness, that there's a God who is there supporting you. That's not immediately evident as one goes to the doctor or goes to the hospital. Not immediately evident. But what the liturgy is trying to say is, no, there's something deeper going on here and you don't want to miss it. And it will happen not just here at Mass, but it will happen in everyday life as well, so that you actually could feel that same presence as you are sitting in the doctor's office or in the hospital. The same thing could happen. So that's the transference. You begin to see the liturgy of life and the liturgy of the sacramental church is supposed to come together somehow. So whatever goes on in the church worship is illuminating what happens in everyday life. As Karl Rahner likes to say, those sacraments, whether it's baptism or the Eucharist or confirmation, marriage, whatever it is, They are the visibility of God's grace. Grace we experience all the time. God's always nourishing us, forgiving us, caring for us. But the sacraments make it visible, tangible. It reminds us of what God is doing always and everywhere for us. So, when we're getting ready to come to church now, we've got at least three components, right? We got our own regimen, which includes fasting and prayer and all that. Then we've got a sense of what cultural symbols have been at work in our own minds and hearts, which ones we carry with us, what dominant images. Then we're coming there to a place where other symbols are celebrated. Now that sets up some sort of an interaction. That sets up potential conflict. It also could be reinforcing. But it's at the deeper levels of ourselves, whatever it is this culture has given us and we've gotten from our families, whatever is deepest in our hearts, what we think is true, how weak God is, and how we try to relate to that God, it's going to interact with the message of the church as a whole, with the Christian tradition as a whole. And sometimes it will produce dominance. So our dominance of what your life is to be the man who controls well and pulls their weight around and thinks of us because with money that we're valuable, then liturgy is going to dissonate. It's done right. It's going to challenge that. It's going to clash with that and say, wait a second. Another way of looking at life. There's other way to value people for other things than their status in the socioeconomic system. At other times, we find a reinforcement in the symbols. So maybe that our sense that I'm trying to pull little ways, I can't do much, and I'm trying to do it my own way, trying to be sensitive to that problem we there. In the liturgy, well, reinforce it. So that's a good thing to do, even though it's worth it. You keep doing that. They get reinforced. But for sure, if we take these seriously, there's going to be an interaction between the tools we carry in our heart from the code in our mind that form the good and the tools that shape from church tradition. Now, we're still prepared to give this gospel now. There's other things that help us to get there. One thing we could do is have a better understanding of the spiritual world and have a better specific understanding of things that are going to occur when we're there for the service. Now, I want to make real practical and specific, and this year we're reading from, this is the cycle of Scripture reading. As you know, we're on a three cycle. AC, Mark, so 1 year, we mostly from Matthew's Gospel Mass. Next year, mostly Mark. Next year, mostly Luke. This third year, the C, we're reading mostly from Luke, was during that. So the readings are from the Gospel of Luke. Let's say that they're in different Christians, so there's one possible except this. That is, that every church has the option of reading a cycle, want to blend. So that could throw this whole life off. All this work and preparation and go down to because there's A in church. But that's not the insurmountable problem. It's the approach would be important. Anyway, this is here Luke and reading C and Luke. Now, what to do is to give background to that. So the more we knew of Luke's gospel, before we get there, the more we understand his prodigal stories from 15th chapter. So now we want to prepare ourselves. Now, we know certain things of the gospel from the historical critical method. So we know that this gospel was written by a fellow Luke, who probably lived in Antioch, Syria. So you trace up the Mediterranean Sea, Israel along here, you go up to almost the most part, find there Antioch of Syria. And that's where we think Luke lived and operated. He wrote his gospel in that community. Now, he did that. He had sources. He tells that in the beginning of the gospel. He was an eyewitness. He didn't run around with Jesus with a notepad and write down what he said. He didn't know Jesus like that. The next generation. So he said, not an eyewitness. What he did was investigate sources, read things, talk to people. One of the things that he read in front of him was Mark's gospel, which was written about the year 70. So he's got Mark in front of him. Then he's got another nice source that unfortunately we don't have. It's called the Q document. And it's a collection of sayings of Jesus, and in there we find the great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, as we call it in Matthew, Sermon on the Plain in Luke, and we have in there the Lord's Prayer. But he's got this document, so he's got a second thing. Then he's got a third source, and some scholars think that that third source came from the fact that he was a physician. Now this is disputed, and we can I put this forward different from the other points here, but the one idea is that Luke was a physician, and that he had access, therefore, to a broad range of human experience. And part of what he had access to was the experience of women. And that therefore, in Luke's gospel, we find a much better portrayal of women's experience. In fact, it appears as though Luke, unique in all the gospels, made a definite effort to parallel in female experience. We find examples of that in the accounts already. Simeon claims that Jesus Messiah and to be cause a scandal to people, and one to cause downfall of men. But right after Simeon gets his words in, appears another prophet, Anna. And Anna then gives her of what's going on. And you can find the same thing. You have the shepherd goes out and gets the lost sheep, but also the woman right after that finds coin in her house. You got an interesting there, and one theory is Luke had access to a broader range of experiences. That women who knew Jesus, acted with Jesus, and told stories of how they acted with them, formed a body of knowledge that somehow Luke had available to him. So we got Luke putting all this together. But why does he do it? He already got one gospel. Why have another? Why don't he just hand out Mimeo's Mark? So they read this and find out what it's all about. Well, the reason is, and this is instructive for us, is because the message of Jesus has to always be translated in a new situation. It's made real in a new culture, new history. So his community had new problems. Living in the decade of the 80s. And the people now are most Greeks, not Jews. Some of them become quite well. Might call them a cosmopolitan middle class that developed. Within this community, it appears as though the well-to-do weren't always treating the poor all that well. So he's got a problem. He's got a further problem on his hand, because some people there are saying, well, wait a second, you keep saying that God's faithful to his promises and the Jews were his chosen people, but they haven't followed Jesus. They rejected him, so God has forgotten his people. He hasn't been faithful. He might not be faithful to us. If he abandoned the Jews, now he might abandon us, Christians. So they had a problem. And Luke tries to answer that problem. Tries to tell them, oh, look, God was faithful. You got that wrong. He was faithful to the Jewish people because he always continues to love them. They can always repent. They can always come back. Always can accept the Messiah. And he's kept his promise in a way that is beyond what people expected. But he kept it. And he will always keep his promise. So he's got that problem that he has to deal with in his community. So he has to write a gospel, because they just hand him Mark, they won't get it. There's a lot of stuff in Mark that uses Aramaic phrases. That's the language Jesus spoke, and these Greek-speaking people don't have the foggiest notion what that's about. There's a lot of the references to the Hebrew Scriptures that aren't explained in Mark, and if his people are going to get it, he's got to put in the explanation of it. Thus we have Luke creating in the middle 80s, somewhere around the year 85, a new gospel. Out of his own experience and out of his own sense of the needs of his community and out of the sources that he has collected. Now we might ask ourselves, well then what becomes the dominant theology of Luke? What's he about? How does he understand Jesus? Always primary. Well, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is clearly the compassionate one. The line in Dante says something about Luke's gospel, Luke presenting Jesus as the epitome of compassion or something. I don't remember the exact words, but that's for Luke, Jesus is the compassion one. One clear example of that is the agony in the garden. When the guy, Peter, cuts off the servant's ear. There's one evangelist that gives us a little tidbit there. It says Jesus cured his ear, fixed his ear out for him. Obviously, Luke always wants to point out Jesus is compassionate. No matter what's happened, he's going to be always tender, caring for the people. So that's one dominant characteristic of Jesus. The other is that he sees him as the prophet, the great prophet. And he's always trying to show that he's, for example, in the transfiguration experience in Luke, what you do is you have a story where Moses and Elijah appear. And the glory is shining through them, but it's also shining through Jesus. And so when you start to read it, you say, boy, look at these Jesus is a prophet. He's as good, important a prophet as Elijah and Moses, who represent the law and the prophets. This is wonderful. Amazing. But then as the story goes on, a voice comes out of the cloud representing Yahweh. And a voice comes out of the cloud and says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. He's the one." In other words, as you read through the story, it becomes clear Jesus isn't just a prophet on the par with Elijah and Moses. He's even greater than they are. He's the greatest of all the prophets. And so in 100 different ways, Luke keeps telling us, look, get it straight. He is a prophetic figure who speaks for God. And he does it in an authoritative way that other prophets were not able to do. Another characteristic of in Luke is that Jesus is often at prayer. He's a prayer. He's the one who puts himself, he had to go off and pray. He has to pray before his temptations. He has to pray when he's picking his disciples. He has to pray before he tells them about the Lord's Prayer. It isn't just he talks about prayer, but Jesus is engaged in that activity himself. Comes the model for prayer. There's a great emphasis in Luke's Gospel, Spirit. Interesting, it reverses the way we usually Jesus sends the Spirit. But Luke's Gospel, when he's out into the desert, for example, out to be tempted like Jesus, well, I think out in the desert and encounter the demonic forces, it says the Spirit guides him into the desert. The Spirit propels him to go out into the desert. The Spirit that seems to be in Jesus, not that he just the Spirit does, but has already got an act force in Jesus, and him to interact with people in a distinct way. So we have another example of distinct characteristics of the Gospel. Then, the other thing about Luke is there's a structure to it. It's quite different from Matthew and Mark in a way. That is, he gives us a salvation history. God is acting history. God's in the world. History is a direction. And the whole history based on this idea. God does something, and then God does it. Luke's Gospel is structured around the city of Jerusalem. It shows stories. He starts out in Galilee, but he must go to the capital city. He said his Jerusalem. His disciples don't want him to go. Dangerous to go, but he's going to go there. Jerusalem, you can see all over in his stories, Jerusalem is brought up in the story. It's the center of this whole thing, of this big story that Luke's got here. Jesus is up here. He's got to go to Jerusalem. Well, that's what the prophets have to do. There he will confront the religious authorities. There he will meet opposition. He did at the beginning. Will meet opposition. That opposition, they were able to kill it, but they can't stop the spirit. They can't stop the movement. Only one can do that. We only know how to turn this and redo it. The interesting thing, it reverses the way we think, but we usually think Jesus is us, the Spirit. But in Luke's Gospel, when he's driven out into the desert, for example, goes out to be tempted, it isn't like Jesus says, well, I think I'll go out in the desert and encounter the demonic forces there. It says the Spirit drives him out into the desert. The Spirit propels him to go out into the desert. It's the Spirit that seems to be acting in Jesus. Not that he just gives the Spirit to us, but the Spirit's already got an active force in Jesus and moving him to act and interact with people in distinctive ways. So we have here another example of the distinctive characteristics of Luke's Gospel. Then, the other thing to see about Luke is there's a structure to it. It's quite different from Matthew and Mark in a certain way. That is, Luke's got a sweep. He's the one that gives us a feel for salvation history. God is active in history. God's running the world, and this history has a direction in it.